Morning. This is just a really quick run through in case you can't make the rescheduled session this week on safeguarding. I'm sorry, I had to move the time. I had something quite urgent coming that I couldn't move. I reckon this will take about 10-15 minutes. So advocacy within safeguarding. The session. The session. Here we go. We're going to cover what the Care Act says about safeguarding processes, and that will mainly include covering what is a safeguarding inquiry and what's a safeguarding review. We'll have a little look at closed cultures because that's a big thing, particularly in institutional settings within safeguarding, and you'll want to just double check that you're familiar with closed cultures. And of course, we'll be touching on the advocacy role throughout. So first thing first is which kind of role covers safeguarding. And there's this tension between the Care Act duties to arrange advocacy and the Mental Capacity Act powers to instruct an advocate. So what we've got is this kind of, you've got two entitlements potentially for a person, and the question is which one trumps the other one. So generally speaking, it's Care Act. And the reason for that is because the Care Act is a duty to instruct, which means that you have to have, duty to arrange, which means that you have to have an advocate offered if you're entitled. And that's right at the beginning of the safeguarding inquiry. So everybody who's entitled to an IMCA, i.e. those people who lack capacity to be involved in the safeguarding process, they're going to hit the criteria for the Care Act. And the Care Act requires that advocacy has to be arranged, and it has to be arranged at the very beginning. IMCA, it doesn't have to be arranged. It's only arranged if it's in the person's best interests. So it's what we call a discretionary power. And the second thing to say is that it's also unclear at what point in the safeguarding process we should have the IMCA. Is it at the beginning? Is it when there's an investigation? Is it when there's a best interest meeting? Is it when protective measures have been agreed upon to look at the potential impact? And essentially the MCA tells us that it depends, that there's a bit of discretion there, that the safeguarding lead, that the local authority can choose essentially when and at what point to arrange IMCA. So that leaves us with the question, if you've got to have a Care Act advocate at the beginning, why would you have an IMCA halfway through or towards the end? It doesn't make any sense. So it will all go to Care Act. The only exception to this is if the alleged perpetrator of the safeguarding lacks capacity. So if the person who is the adult for care and support needs, that person will come into Care Act advocacy, but Care Act advocacy isn't available for an alleged perpetrator who lacks capacity, whereas the Mental Capacity Act does introduce IMCA. We're talking very small numbers, but that is there. So I hope that kind of wraps up and explains which advocate should be working in which decision making. Right, let's have a little look at what the Care Act tells us about safeguarding. So the Care Act was really significant because before the Care Act, there were no statutory duties to have safeguarding adults boards. It was generally seen as good practice, and most local authorities did have them, but it wasn't a statutory duty. And that's significant because that meant it could vary from local authority to local authority. Care Act requires each local authority to set up a board. And the key things that a board has to do is they have to make inquiries, or they can delegate that function. They can ask other people to make inquiries if it suspects an adult is at risk of abuse or neglect. Now, a couple of things about this. They can delegate that, as I say. So an obvious example is a mental health hospital, say it's a private setting. You can have a scenario where the local authority asks that hospital to investigate its own safeguarding inquiries. I think there's a general cynicism about that. And if you're concerned, I think I would be raising that with the Safeguarding Adults Board. It also allows for like an independent organisation to do those inquiries. But the bottom line is it's the local authority who has the legal duty to make sure that those inquiries are being done properly. A safeguarding review is different from a safeguarding inquiry, and we're going to look at the difference. But the Safeguarding Adults Board, they have a duty to arrange reviews where they're required. And of course, they have to ensure that there's provisions in place that advocacy is arranged where appropriate. Advocacy services sometimes sit on adult safeguarding boards. It makes sense for an advocacy service if you don't sit on the board to have a route into influencing. I think is a very minimum. You want to have a clear channel of communication, particularly about referrals, particularly if you're worried about referrals being low, and to be able to feed back people's experiences of safeguarding, I think is really critical. And you guys have that insight, so it's really important that you have that channel to the board. So if you don't sit on the board yourself, talk to the chair about, can you have an opportunity to perhaps to present to the board about your findings and themes and people's experiences and issues that you're coming across. So let's have a little think then about safeguarding inquiries. So this is where there are concerns that somebody is currently experiencing or is at risk of experiencing abuse or neglect. The duties only apply to an adult who has needs for care and support. So we're thinking about adults with care and support needs. And the criteria is essentially, as a result of having those care and support needs, the person is unable or limited in how they can protect themselves from the actual abuse or neglect or the risk of abuse or neglect. These are the descriptions, the categories of different types of abuse. It feels really cold listing these. I mean, these are horrific experiences for people. So I apologise for it just kind of listing it as if it's, yeah, just something a bit blasé. It's worth taking a moment to just think about the different types of abuse and neglect that people can experience. The Care Act introduced a number of new categories of abuse. Modern slavery, there's been a huge amount of work done in the last 10 years in people's understanding of modern slavery. And also organisational abuse is worth mentioning here because of closed cultures and a recognition that institutions can be the cause of abuse, either through deliberate acts or through neglect. So abuse isn't it includes the physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse that perhaps we might immediately think of, but it's much broader than that as well. So thinking about an inquiry, the process is the concern is raised. The local authority will then make a decision as to whether to investigate, and they will undertake an inquiry. And the purpose of the inquiry, well, let me just pause for a second and give you 15 seconds to think about what is the purpose of an inquiry. What do you think? What do you think the point of an inquiry is? Because the point of the inquiry, and it's not insignificant, is to keep the person safe. It's to take action to keep them safe. So the inquiry will need to establish what's happened or is there's a risk of happening. So establish facts, and then look at the second. This is a list from the Care Act guidance, by the way. The second thing on that, the aims, is to find out what the adult wants to happen. What are their views? What are their wishes? What are their experiences? And as an advocate, of course, we are there to say that, no matter what the person's views are. So if the adult is saying, I don't recognise this as abuse. My son is taking money, but it's okay. He's a good kid. I don't need to do anything about it. Then that's what we say. that's exactly what we say. If the adult is saying, I'm frightened, I don't feel looked after, that's what we say. We are putting forward. So an advocate is really, really helping the local authority achieve that second aim. But be clear, it is the local authority's job to ascertain the adult's views and wishes. Other aims of the inquiry is to assess what needs the adult has for protection. And then really it's all about taking action, so what needs to happen to keep the person safe. And the inquiry should, in terms of the process, there's usually a best interest meeting, but there will always be protective measures that are suggested. As an advocate, you might be there to help influence or help the person understand what they could look like. There was a wonderful report I recommend you have a quick look at, which is called Strengthening the Role of Advocacy and Making Safeguarding Personal. And the kind of the four highlights for me from this report is a recognition that advocacy isn't understood, perhaps as much as it should be, from local authority professionals. That there was lots of inconsistency about safeguard and concern. What is one? And I think you guys know that the amount of concerns that you might raise that are not taken seriously. There's a recognition that every advocate has a safeguarding role, not just Care Act advocates and IMCAs. And then there are also concerns about the lack of monitoring of advocacy. So that includes things like we have no idea of how many people actually get an advocate in safeguarding processes. We don't know the impact of advocacy. We don't know in terms of equalities, which groups of people get an advocate. And there's so very, very little monitoring. And that is the link there, which will give you the full report. Oh, okay. We won't do that slide. A quick note on the advocacy role within safeguarding inquiry. And it's the same advocacy that we talk about week in, week out. It's about helping the person self-advocate and express their concerns, their hopes, their aspirations, how to get a good life, whatever it is that they want to say. It's also about representation, particularly if the person lacks capacity. You are there to represent and find out what those things could be. And then you've got the audit function, so to check that the safeguarding process is following the law and upholding the person's rights. And I've just put a little note there at the bottom, just to confirm that advocacy within safeguarding is still wishes and feelings. It's never the advocate promoting best interests. So just wanted to throw that in. Even within safeguarding, the local authority, their job is to make best interest decisions. Our job is to push for wishes and feelings. This is a quick slide that just acknowledges what the Care Act guidance says about the advocacy role. I share this with a cautionary nod because there's some really weird stuff on here. I don't think the person who wrote it fully understood advocacy, if I'm being honest, because it says some strange things like, an advocate should help the person understand what actions of their own may expose them to avoidable abuse and neglect. I don't think an advocate would necessarily lead on that. I think the only thing we would lead on is the first thing, decide what outcomes, changes the person wants. The rest on this list, I think, is very much the social worker's role or the safeguarding lead, unless the person wants you to do that. So 100% if the person wants to explore what actions of their own might expose them to abuse or neglect, then I'm there. I'm showing up and I'm willing to have that conversation. But I don't think I'd be leading that conversation. Is my point on this slide. The only thing I'm leading is that first one. What outcomes, what changes does the person want? Right, so that's an inquiry. Remember, an inquiry is about current risk. It's about keeping the person safe. It's about taking action now to keep them safe. A safeguarding review is different, totally different process and totally different circumstances why you'd have a review. A safeguarding review is where there has been abuse or neglect in the past, and as a result of that, the person has died. Or if the person hasn't died, it could be that the person's experienced serious abuse or neglect. And in both of these instances, the local authority is under a duty to carry out a review. And the aim of the review is to basically find out, sorry, skipping slides. The aim of the review is to find out what they could and should have done differently to inform future plans. There's lots of very high profile reviews. This month we had the Walton Hall, the summary. It's worth a read. It absolutely slates advocacy. I think there's 5 key recommendations. One of them is, or findings, sorry. One of them is that there was an illusion of advocacy in place, but it didn't really have an impact. That's something that we need to own and look at. How are advocates in institutions, how are you guys, how's your organisation helping to contribute to keeping people safe? And it's well worth looking at that review, the Walton Hall review. But yeah, if you Google your area, whatever area you are in, and Google Safeguarding Review reports, some of them will be kicked up and you'll be able to read them. There isn't an entitlement to advocacy in a review, but it's a bit of a strange one because it's if the person's died, they won't have an advocate. So really, it's about for those people who have experienced serious abuse or neglect, then that's then where you can help the person to be involved. You can represent them, and also kind of bear witness as they go through that process. But your role in Safeguarding Review is it's not about changing things now, because if they were at risk now, it would be an inquiry. The purpose of a review is to help the local authority find out what went wrong, basically. So I think the role is a bit different. It's less about making decisions for the future and perhaps more about walking alongside that individual to help make sure that they're involved. Just go back a slide to this report, which is very significant. Every couple of years, a big report comes out which analyses reviews, and I thought this was really interesting because in this period, 2017 to 2019, a fifth of safeguarding adulthood hadn't completed any. I think that's quite significant. So a fifth, 22%, over a fifth. Nobody suffered, serious abuse or neglect. Nobody died as a result, which, doesn't, I don't know. I think that's concerning. And look at this, only 6 people actually had an advocate. So there's a question there around why are so few people getting an advocate in reviews? And as an advocacy service, how do you have that conversation with the Safeguarding Adult Board to make sure that it's triggered? Right, so before we finish, quick focus on closed culture. You may have heard of it. You may not have. It's gained more status in the last few years since Walton Hall. I think CQC have a whole project looking at closed cultures, and they describe it as a poor culture in a health or care service that increases the risk of harm. It includes abuse and human rights breaches. The development of closed cultures can be deliberate, but it can also be unintentional. But either way, it can cause unacceptable harm to a person and their loved ones, their families. So, as an advocate, we've got to be very mindful of closed cultures, and closed cultures are kind of characterized by certain things, and the CQC in their research, they found that more closed cultures are more likely to develop if you have people who are removed from their communities. And if you think about institutional settings, that happens a lot. People don't get out. People are removed from family. They might be miles away from home and friends. They, in a care home, ask yourself who is around this person who isn't paid to be there? Where are their allies, their natural allies? How often, do they go to the shops by themselves? Who do they have? Who is their community? Where is their community? And if people are in institutional settings and are removed from communities, then closed cultures are more likely to happen, to develop. It's also more likely where people stay for long periods of time. So if you think about people with learning disability and autistic people in mental health settings, this is a huge, huge challenge because people are removed from the communities. And I think at the last count, the average stay was 5.9 years away from your family. That's significant, isn't it? It's not a 3-month crisis intervention in a hospital, it's years. So close culture is more likely to develop there. Weak leadership, which we can see in any of the reviews and the panorama exposés, the weak leadership is rife. And then there's a lack of the right staff. So whether that's the right skills, the right training, lack of supervision, just inexperienced people, people on minimum wage, in quite complex settings, then closed cultures are more likely to develop as people kind of don't know what poor practice looks like and then tries to hide it or cover up, at the extreme. And then the fifth indicator or more like, issue where it leads to closed cultures is where there's this lack of positive engagement and a lack of openness. And I think today what that's like in institutions that you work in. If you do work in institutions, you'll know whether there's an open engagement with staff. It's often the feeling in your tummy. Are staff genuinely welcoming of advocacy? Do they see you as part of that safety cushion? Or are they suspicious? Do they prevent you from going into certain areas of the hospital? I remember going on to hospital by invitation of a family, and the response to the hospital was to escort me from the premises. If that's an indicator of a closed culture, why didn't they want a family advocate to go in and meet their loved one? That to me is like screaming closed culture. It's not screaming abuse. I'm not making that jump, but that is screaming that ward, that hospital is more likely to develop a closed culture because they haven't got that transparency and openness. Other hospitals I go into, it feels differently. The staff are friendly, pleasant, welcoming, do things, are responsive, welcome advocacy. That and again, that isn't then saying this is completely safe, but it's an indicator. And I think as an advocate, you want to have a space within your organisation to talk about this, talk about the feelings in your tummy. Where are the wards that you're concerned about? Where could closed cultures exist? It's not as if you have a tick box and you go along ticking it. It's a feeling. But these are some of the things to be mindful of. And of course, we take no pleasure in saying this, but this is where abuse, neglect, and harm is more likely to take place. So we've got to be talking and thinking about this as advocates. Are there institutions in your area that you work in where you feel close culture is happening? In which case, you need to think about how are you going to perhaps have more of a presence and put more support in and have more, keep an eye really. So closed cultures. On the training, we'll do a kind of a little exercise here. So if you wanted to do that, I would pause the little video now, jot this down. And this is just to really have a very brutal reflection on are these things happening in this area, in your area? Okay. And that's the end. So I'll just finish by leaving that up as we say our goodbyes. Key points from this shortened webinar. Safeguarding inquiry is there to keep the person safe now. Safeguarding review is to look at past abuse or if a person has died. The advocacy role within safeguarding is exactly the same as all other types of advocacy. You're there to help the person understand what's happening. You're there to help the person express what they want to happen, make choices. And if it's non-instructed advocacy, you are essentially trying your best to find out what the answers to those questions will be. Before we finish, I would also like to just give a little nod to safe working within safeguarding. And that's just to acknowledge that because of the nature of risk in safeguarding and because the person might be at risk now, alleged perpetrators of the abuse might pose a risk to other professionals involved. So usually when you have receive a referral for advocacy support, you probably go and meet the person straight away. I think in safeguarding, you really want to have a chat with the safeguarding lead and the social worker before you do that. And part of that, of course, is your usual advocacy. What do you need to know about the person? How do they communicate? Is there a better time to see them? Those types of things. But it's also about risk. Am I safe to go and see them at home? Is it best if you and the safeguarding lead go together to talk about the safeguarding concern? You want to check this point. Does the person know about the safeguarding concern? It's astonishing how many times the person isn't told and things kind of get set off in motion. So I think it's very sensible to have that conversation at the very beginning rather than after you've gone and met the person. So I hope that's helpful. As always, if anything I've said is a bit unclear, drop us an email and hopefully see you next time. All right then, guys, take care. Bye.